The story which follows is in no sense a romance. I wish in the first place to ask the readers of the following narrative to believe that I am in no way attempting to impose upon their credulity. Concerning the amazing spectacle I am about to describe, I report nothing but plain facts. However astounding and apparently incredible they may seem at first glance, precisely as they appeared to my own eyes, and I am possessed of excellent sight, and to those of my 3 companions, all 3 white men, without counting 5 Indians of the Clayoquot tribe, who have their camps on the shores of the River Stewart. The following are the names of the 3 ocular witnesses who are ready to testify to the truth of my assertions. The first is my hunting companion for many years, Mr. James Lewis Butler, banker of San Francisco. The second is Mr. Tom Leemore, miner from McQuestion River in the Yukon Territory. And lastly, the Reverend Father Pierre Lavanieux, a Canadian Frenchman and missionary at the Indian village of Armstrong Creek, not far from McQuestion. In the course of 10 years rambling in the 4 quarters of the world, it has been my lot to witness a great number of amazing spectacles, and the strange experience of which I speak had become no more than a vivid recollection when, a few days ago, on January 24th, 1908, the following letter reached me at Paris. It came from Father Lavanieux, who passes his life with his savage flock 600 miles northwest of the Klondike. I give it here, word for word. Armstrong Creek, January 1st, 1908. My dear son, the trader of McQuestion has just stopped here with his train of dogs and sledges. He has had a hard journey from Dawson by Barlow, Flat Creek, and Dominion. I expect to receive by him in another fortnight fresh provisions and news of the outside world. Today is the first day of the new year, and I want this letter to express my affectionate wishes for your health and happiness. I hope it will give me the pleasure of receiving you under my humble roof here at the other end of the earth. I will not believe that you will let your old friend in the great north leave his old carcass to the Indians, who will some day or other make his coffin out of branches, without seeing him once more. I have received your book, the reading of which has given me the greatest pleasure. By the way, you are wrong in regard to that poor fellow John Spitz. Alas, he is no longer mail carrier of the Duncan district. He died, poor fellow, at Eagle Camp soon after you departed, not having survived the wound he received from the bald face, which you will remember. The bald or cinnamon bear, the brown bear of the Arctic regions. Talking of ferocious animals, will you believe me when I tell you that 10 of my Indians and myself saw again, on Christmas Eve, that horrible beast of Partridge Creek passing like a whirlwind over the frozen surface of the river, breaking off with his hind feet enormous blocks of ice from the rough surface. His fur was covered with hoarfrost, and his little eyes gleamed like fire in the twilight. The beast held in his jaws something which seemed to me to be a caribou. It was moving at the rate of more than 10 miles an hour. The temperature that day was 45 degrees below zero. At the corner of the cutoff, it disappeared. It is undoubtedly the same animal that we saw before. Accompanied by Chief Steinshane and 2 of his sons, I followed the traces which were exactly like those which we all saw, Leemore, Butler, you and I, in the mud of the Moose Lick. 6 times on the snow we were able to measure the impression of its enormous body, the same size as we found it before, almost to the 20th of an inch. We followed them to Stewart, fully 2 miles, when the snow began to fall slightly and blotted out the traces. It was on receipt of this letter that I decided to write the story of my own experience, which it recalled so vividly to mind, and of which it afforded a striking confirmation. The station of McQuestion, that far-off corner of the strange country of the Yukon, where the 8 months of winter are so terrible, but the short summer so marvelously beautiful, was on 4 occasions my chosen retreat during the 8 years that I have known the North. A friend of mine in San Francisco, Mr. Butler, who had come to Dawson City in order to purchase gold mining concessions, had promised to join me in order that we should go hunting together. I was taking my coffee one afternoon in the veranda of Father Lavanieux's cabin, when all at once I heard someone whistle from the farther bank of the river. A bark canoe, paddled by 2 Indians, was coming up the river in the shadow of the trees. Butler was with them. "My dear fellow," he said, smiling as I met him and endeavoring to hide his visible agitation, "I have something very strange to tell you. Do you know that prehistoric monsters still exist?" I broke out laughing, and together we returned by the little path which led to the father's house. When Butler had taken off his muddy boots and was ensconced in a comfortable seat, he began to recount his story as follows. Leaving Gravel Lake, where I arrived on Tuesday evening, my last stage was the mouth of Clear Creek, where I knew that you would send someone to meet me. Traveling was frightfully bad, 40 miles of marshy country. At last, at nightfall, I descended a hill and had the pleasure of seeing Grant's cabin, which was lighted up. Grant was at home, and a good supper was waiting for me. Early the next morning, yesterday, he came to tell me in his reserved and silent manner that 3 fine moose were feeding quietly behind the plateau of Partridge Creek. After swallowing a hasty mouthful, all 4 of us, Grant, your 2 men, and I, started off from the hut. At the top of the hill where we'd hidden ourselves, all of us stretched full length on the ground, we perceived, a short distance off in the valley near a moose lick, a sulphur spring, rarely freezing in the winter where animals come to drink at all seasons. 3 enormous moose, moving slowly forward and quietly browsing on the moss and lichens. All at once they gave 3 simultaneous bounds, and one of the males giving vent to the striking bellow which these animals utter only when they are hunted or mortally wounded. The 3 went off at a mad gallop towards the south. What had happened? We decided to approach the spot where the animals had taken fright so suddenly. Arriving at the moose lick, a spot about 60 feet long and 15 wide, we saw in the mud and almost on a level with the water of the lick, the fresh imprint of the body of a monstrous animal. Its belly had made an impression in the slime more than 2 feet deep, 30 feet long and 12 feet wide. 4 gigantic paws, also deeply impressed, had left at each end of the main imprint and a little to the side, footprints 5 feet long by 2.5 feet wide, the claws being more than a foot long, the sharp points of which had buried themselves deeply in the mud. There was also the print apparently of a heavy tail, 10 feet long and 16 inches wide at the point. We followed the tracks of the monster in the valley for 5 or 6 miles, and then at the ravine of Partridge Creek, a place which the miners call a gulch, they ceased suddenly as if by enchantment. The next day at 5 o'clock in the morning, Father Lavenieux, Butler, Leemore, a neighboring miner, hastily summoned, myself and 5 men of the tribe crossed the River Stewart in 2 canoes. Neither of the first 2 guides, who were overcome with terror, nor the sergeant of the mounted police, who received our story with skepticism, nor the letter carrier would consent to accompany us. All day long we searched without result the valley of the little river McQueston, the flats of Partridge Creek, and the country between Barlow and the lofty snow-covered mountains. At last, towards evening, tired out after having toiled for a long time through the great marsh, we lighted a fire at the top of a rocky ravine. The sun was setting. Lying by the fire, we let our eyes wander over the glittering expanse of marsh which we had just traversed. The tea was boiling and everyone was preparing to dip his tin cup into the pot when suddenly a noise of rolling stones and a strange, harsh and frightful roar made us all spring to our feet. The beast for which we had been looking, a black, gigantic form, the corners of his mouth filled with blood-stained slime, his jaws munching something I know not what, was slowly and heavily climbing the opposite side of the ravine, making the large boulders roll into the valley as he went. Struck with terror, Father Lavenieux, Leemore, and myself tried to utter a cry of fright, but no sound issued from our parched throats. Unconsciously, we had seized each other's arms. The 5 Indians were crouching down with their faces against the ground, trembling like leaves shaken by the wind. Butler was already rushing down the hill. "The Dinosaurus! It is the Dinosaurus of the Arctic Circle!" muttered Father Lavenieux with chattering teeth. The monster had stopped, scarcely 20 paces from us, and resting upon his huge belly was staring motionless at the red sun, which was bathing all the landscape in a weird light. For a full 10 minutes, riveted to the spot by some strange force which we could not overcome, did we contemplate this terrible apparition. We were, however, in full possession of all our senses. There was not, and never will be in our minds, the least doubt as to the reality of what we saw. It was indeed a living creature, and not an illusion, which we had before us. The Dinosaurus then turned his immense neck, but did not seem to see us. His withers were at least 18 feet above the ground, his entire body, from the extremity of his yawning jaws, which were surmounted by a horn like that of a rhinoceros, to the end of the tail must have measured at least 50 feet. His hide was like that of a wild boar, garnished with thick bristles in color a grayish black. His belly was plastered with thick mud. At this moment, Butler returned to us. He told us that he thought the animal weighed about 30 tons. Suddenly the Dinosaurus moved his jaws, visibly chewing some thick, viscid kind of food, and we heard a sound like that of the crunching of small bones. Then, with a sudden movement, he raised himself on his hind legs, and giving utterance to a roar, a hollow, indescribable, frightful sound, and wheeling around with surprising agility, with movements resembling those of a kangaroo, he sprang with a prodigious bound into the ravine. On the 24th, Butler and myself, having taken 2 days' rest, started for Dawson City, for the purpose of demanding from the governor 50 armed men and mules. Here my story ends. For a month, we were the laughingstock of the Golden City, and the Dawson Daily Nugget published an article about me, which was, at the same time, flattering and satirical, entitled Arrival of Poe.
Happy Canada Day, everyone, and a big thank you, as always, to my Patreon supporters, particularly Michael Fattori and Break System BSE. If you liked this exhibit, you might also like my social media presence on Twitter, Instagram, and the like. Links to all of those are in the description. And thanks for being you.